Okay, and looks like we're live, so we're going to begin. This is going to be a very small class, as we can see. Hopefully a few other people will join us later on. And do me a favor, if other folks do join and you see something in chat, just shout it out because they do not have the chat window on. Alright, let me bring up the PowerPoint and we will proceed. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is Names 101, Introduction to Name Rules. I'm Yehuda ben Moshe, I'm Elmet Herald, and if you've taken the first class in the series, you should already know what that means. So let's get started. So there are two types of names we have that are registered in the SCA. Personal names, which are covered by SINA section PN, and non-personal names covered by NPN. Non-personal names are things like SCA branches, heraldic titles, award orders, households. I think that's just about it. We do not cover non-personal names in this class. Most of the rules are the same. There are a few differences, but that's most beginner heralds don't deal as much with NPN, so we will cover the personal names. So first off, we looked at this in the first class, but as a refresher, we have to look at what is period. The SCA defines period as before 1600. So that's what we want. We want names from before 1600. However, we allow something called the gray period, which is the period between 1600 and 1650, and we will allow name elements from the gray period. It's based on the idea that something found in that time is probably existed beforehand. So if you're trying to document let's say the name John Smith, and the absolutely earliest record you find is, let's say, a marriage record from 1612, well, chances are good that that person was born before 1600, and so that name existed. And even if he wasn't born yet, then probably that was also not the first John Smith in history. His father might have been named that, his uncle, grandfather, whatever. So we give the benefit of the doubt to the submitter and say anything between 1600 and 1650 we will allow. 1650, however, is a hard cutoff. And if the earliest you can find is 1651, that's not going to fly. There's also an exception to the gray period, and that's if we know something didn't exist beforehand. And the most common example for that with names is names from Shakespeare. Shakespeare invented a lot of names, and if the first appearance of a name is in a Shakespearean play that was not published until 1604, then we can be reasonably certain that name was not around before 1600. So, but those things are rare. Now, the SCA actually does not have a beginning cutoff time. You know, your persona can be Ugg the Caveman if you really want to. There's actually no beginning. However, for name registering purposes, the rule is that the name has to come from a culture known to medieval and Renaissance Europe. So, for example, classical Greek and Roman elements are acceptable because Europe knew about classical Greece and Rome. Elements from Pharaonic Egypt are not. Pharaonic Egypt, although it predates 1600, wasn't known to Europeans until the 19th century. So you cannot register names from that. Similarly, Ugg the Caveman would not be registered. There's also a question of place. Generally speaking, any part of Europe is always allowed, and Europe goes basically as far east as Russia, as far south as Greece and Italy and Spain. It probably does not include the Middle East, and it probably does not include Muslim Spain directly. However, names from other cultures are allowed if they had contact with period Europe. So Japanese names are allowed because there was contact between Japan and Europe. Chinese names are allowed. However, names from the interior of Africa, from northeastern Asia, from the interior of the Americas are generally not allowed, because Australia is right out, because those cultures did not have contact with Europe in period. The other thing to be aware of, and this is about the only thing we'll comment on non-personal names, is that you cannot name SCA branches after using non-European names. And the logic is that the SCA takes place in Europe. If you have a Japanese name and persona, then you're a traveler traveling to Europe. Branches don't get to travel. So even if it's a branch that's located physically in China, it cannot use a Chinese name. So, a few definitions. A given name is the main personal name of somebody. It's usually given at birth or during some sort of a naming ceremony, such as a baptism or christening. What we think of as first names today is a given name. Some cultures allow multiple given names. For example, most modern middle names are really double given names. Some cultures do not. The other thing we have is a byname. And basically, a byname is any part of the name that's not the given name. And there are lots of different types of bynames, and not all cultures used all of those types of bynames. What we think of as last name today, that's a type of byname. Specifically, it's a type of byname called an inherited surname. SINA Appendix B describes in detail all the different types of bynames. We're going to hit the highlights of them, but if you want more info, that's the place to look. So, the types of bynames that we use. The first is the locative. And a locative byname simply describes where the person is from. It can be marked. What does marked mean? Marked means there's some sort of a grammatical element that makes it a locative byname. So, for example, if you have someone named of York, John of York, that's a locative byname. He's from York. The mark, in this case, is the word of. In French, you could have de Marseille. In German, you could have von Hamburg. All of those have something marking it as a locative. In some languages, that's not a separate word, but a grammatical construction of the name, of the word. Russian, for example. You can also have unmarked locatives. For example, Jack London is probably Jack from London, but there's no marking. It's just using the name of the place. That's permitted in some languages. It's not permitted in others. The next common type of byname is the patronymic. It's formed from a person's father's name. These are some of the earliest and most common bynames, especially in earlier period you see these a lot, and certain cultures they're very, very common. Norse, for example. I know at least one of the Scandinavian countries didn't get rid of patronymics and switched to what we think of as last names until the 20th century. Russia still uses patronymics as as kind of a middle name element. Again, they can be marked. So a few examples here: Niall's daughter, daughter of Neil; Johnson, son of John. Petrovich is Russian, meaning son of Peter. In all three cases here, an ending is added to indicate that it's a patronymic. It can also be unmarked. John Henry may well be John, son of Henry. English allows unmarked patronymics. You do see matronymics occasionally based on the mother's name. They tend to be rare and only occur in certain cultures. We have descriptive bynames. It's formed from some sort of a distinguishing characteristic. The Tall is in English, John the Tall. Gross is German for great. What the person we call Charlemagne was called Karl the Gross in German. We have one from Norse called Gullskegger, which means gold beard, presumably someone with a blonde beard or something. So these are all descriptives of some characteristic of the person. A type of descriptive byname is what we call an occupational byname, which describes the person's occupation. Draper in English. Guerrero is Spanish for soldier. Sardello is an Italian byname that you see with people in the sardine trade, fishermen, sellers, brokers, and such. So these are names formed from their occupation. We also have a type of byname called a dictus, also sometimes called alias or cognamento, and this is usually a second given name that the person goes by. So, for example, Johannes dictus John is Johannes called John. It's very common. Let me back up still. Dictus bynames are very common with when you have a combination of Latin and vernacular names. So the person's name may be recorded in Latin as Johannes, but he's called John. So a court record or church record might well record it like that. Johannes dictus John. Johannes called John. And what that really is the Latin and the vernacular. Not always. Sometimes it's just a nickname. And then we have inherited by names. Inherited by names can be clan names. For example, very common in Ireland, and I'm going to butcher the names because I cannot pronounce Gaelic at all, but O'Concobair would be masculine, the feminine would be Indian Wee Concobair, and those indicate that the person belongs to a clan. And then finally we have the inherited surname, which is basically the modern last name. It's passed on from generation to generation. Generally speaking, the later in period you go, the more you see inherited surnames. The earlier you go, the more you see occupationals and locatives and descriptives and everything but the inherited surnames.
I would also say that sometimes we inherit them that are all of those other ones.
Well, that's absolutely correct. Very often
my modern last name is a locative Italian by name. Absolutely.
Very often, in fact, I would almost say most of the time, the inherited surname started as one of the other types of bynames. I mentioned John Henry as an example of a patronymic. Well, today John Henry would be someone's last name. Henry would be someone's last name. So yeah, very, very common that they're based on one of the other names. And sometimes it's important to tell which is which, and sometimes it's not. If you have someone who wants to register John Henry, you can document it as a surname, you can document it as an inherited surname, you can document it as a patronymic. Does the person care which way you do it? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. If they just want the name, then it doesn't matter. All right, a name phrase. A name phrase, this is a part of the SCA rules terminology, is a complete given name or a complete by name, including all the associated prepositions, articles, and other requirements. So, for example, we had, John of London. That's made up of two name phrases. There's John, which is the complete given name, and there's of London, which is the complete by name. We talk about naming pools. This is a group of name phrases that are in use in a particular place and time. So it might be something like 14th century England or 13th century France. Naming pools are grouped into what we call regional naming groups. This is a group of naming pools that are culturally linked. And one example is, for example, from the British Isles. English is a naming pool. Welsh is a naming pool. They're both part of the same regional naming group because the cultures really were very linked, and there was a lot of trading of names back and forth. So, what do we need to do to be able to register a name? First, each name phrase must be acceptable, meaning it must be documented in some way, and that's covered by PN1. The combination of name phrases must be acceptable, that's PN2, and it has to be free of conflict, presumption, and offense. And the neat thing about SINA, the current rule set, is it pretty much walks you through step by step on how to do a name. I say the Armory rules are a list of things you're not allowed to do. The names rules are a list of not just things that you are allowed to do, but how to do them. It's really makes it very, very easy. You just go through it. You start with PN1, and you find acceptable name phrases. Then you go to PN2, and you combine them in the right way, and then you check PM3, 4, and 5 to make sure they don't break one of those requirements. So what does that mean? Let's talk about name phrases. First of all, a given name phrase must come from the same place and time. It must be internally consistent as to grammar and structure. Not the whole name, but the whole name phrase. You can't mix languages within a name phrase unless you have evidence of that mixing. So, for example, Saxony is a region of Germany. You cannot say von Saxony. The reason you can't say it is because von is a German patronymic marker, locative marker, and Saxony is the English name for that area. You're mixing German and English. You can say von Saxon, which would be a completely German name, or you can say of Saxony, which would be a completely English language name referring to that part of Germany, but you can't mix and match within the name phrase. So that's important. Again, unless we have evidence otherwise. For example, in period English, we use day, the French de, day, as a marker for locative all the time, because it was there from Latin, it was there from Norman French. So John de London is perfectly permitted, because that is well attested. So where do we get name phrases? Name phrases can be attested. A name phrase is considered attested if the complete name phrase is found in an acceptable source. This includes minor spelling variants. So if we have a period, I don't know, court document, and that court document says, John Smith sued John Henry, we've now got attested versions of John, Smith, and Henry. Okay, this is usually the best option. If we can document exactly that name in exactly that form, we're done. Minor spelling variants are okay. So for example, in Renaissance English, I and Y were pretty much interchangeable. So if you can attest the name Annis with an I, that also counts as attesting Annis with a Y. And unfortunately, there is no master list of which variants are okay and which are not. You just kind of have to learn it through osmosis, I guess, through experience. It's in the, the rulings about it are in the LOARs, and you just have to learn. So a single period example of an attested name phrase is enough for registration. That's important. If you find one reference to Annis, you're good. You do not need to find multiple ones. If you can't attest a name phrase, you can construct a name phrase. A name phrase can be constructed if you have a pattern of name constructions. Now here you need 3 documented examples of the desired pattern to register. Now, you don't always need them because a lot of patterns are very well documented. A lot of reference materials that we use list name patterns, and if they're in a book that we know and trust, then that's good enough. But if you have a one that's not well known, then you need 3 examples of the pattern before you can use it. So an example of a construct name is diminutives. In some languages, you add or remove an ending to create a diminutive. So in Italian, if you have the attested name Urbano, you can create the byname Urbanino because they added Nino to the end of names to make it a diminutive. So you may not be able to find any evidence of Urbanino in period, but we do know we have lots of examples of names following this pattern. So that's an example of construction. That's interesting. Here's another one. This is very common in Anglo-Saxon. You have what's called dithemic names, which are names constructed of 2 parts, a prototheme and a deuterotheme. The prototheme is the first half, the deuterotheme is the second, and you can construct them from other protothemes and deuterothemes. But you can't misuse the combinations. So let's take a look at an example. Let's say we have an attested Old English name Elfgar, which is made up of the prototheme Elf and the deuterotheme Gar. We also have an attested Old English name Edmund, which has the prototheme Id and the deuterotheme Mund. So we can take one of those protothemes and one of those deuterothemes, stick them together, and make Elfmund. Now we don't have evidence for Elfmund, so it's not an attested name, it's a constructed one. But we can't take 2 deuterothemes, stick them together, and make Garmund, or take 2 protothemes and make Alfed, or take 3 of them and make Alfgarmund, because that's not the pattern of dithemic names. Old English is probably the most common use of this construction method, but other languages do use them as well. Again, there's no master list. You just kind of have to know the languages and know the naming patterns. Another example is bynames. These are very, very often constructed because usually we have an attested given name, and you say, well, we want to be the child of that person. So in Old Norse, the standard patronymic for men is the possessive form of the father's name plus the word son. So if we have the attested given name Bjartmar, we can make it possessive by changing it to Bjartmars, and then adding the son at the end. Yartmar's son is now a constructed patronymic. We don't need to document this pattern because this pattern is very well documented in books that we have on Old Norse naming practices. So this is a pattern that you get to just use. Place names can be constructed from attested elements, but we're pretty strict on these. So, for example, suppose you have Oxford, Swinford, and Hartford as English place names. So the pattern is not, something Ford. The pattern is large hoofed animal plus Ford. So you can use this to construct Sheepford. You don't get to construct it to make it Duckford or Bookford. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Where did those names come from? Well, because somebody crossed a river with a bunch of oxen or a bunch of pigs. And it's kind of hard to cross a river with a bunch of oxes and pigs. It's really not a big deal to cross a ford with ducks. It's not really remarkable. And books are just really weird. So we're
trying to drive books across the river wouldn't work well.
Yeah. So exactly. So this is a pattern we tend to be very strict about. You can use it, but you have to be very close to the origin. So this is the classic example out of Sina. All right. Another source of name phrases is what's called the Lingua Anglica allowance. And this is an SCA creation. And it basically says that some name phrases you're allowed to just translate into standard modern English. This applies to attested or constructed descriptive, occupational, and locative binaries. And their rules are not exactly identical for this. The idea is to preserve the meaning for the benefit of the modern English speaker. It has to be literal and plausible translation. So, for example, we have the Norse byname Inraudi. Inraudi is translated as the Red, as in, for example, Eric the Red. So you can register a Norse name with the Red in it, but you can't make that the Bloody or the Scarlet. It has to be literal and plausible translation. Now, the important thing to remember about this is, in order to use the Lingua Anglica allowance, you first have to document that name, either as an attested or constructed, in that language. And the idea is, if you want to be called, Eric the Red, and you call yourself Eric Inraudi, most people will go, what the heck's Inraudi? And that's not the goal. What you're trying to do is the message you're conveying is that you're Eric the Red. If everyone around you spoke Old Norse, they'd all know what Inraudi means, but in the SCA, most people don't speak Old Norse. So we will allow you to translate it to preserve meaning. For locatives, we don't translate meaning, but what we can use is the standard modern English version of the name. So, for example, the city name Cairo is derived from the word for victorious in probably Arabic. So the Lingua Anglica is of Cairo. It's not of the victorious. We don't go because that's not what we call that city. So in Arabic it would be Al-Kahira, but if you want, but most people again won't know what the heck Al-Kahira is. So if you want to be, somebody from Cairo, you can say, well, Al-Kahira is a documentable name, so I'm just going to use the Lingua Anglica allowance to turn it into of Cairo. Now, you can't be of Al-Kahira, because that's not the standard English form. It's got to be of Cairo. Now, very important, you cannot use Lingua Anglica allowance to translate the meanings of given names or place names. We looked at the example of victorious here. It's also, you can't use the baby name books, Well, I can document the name Michael, and Michael means, I don't know what, strong ruler, so I want to register strong ruler. No. We don't translate, first of all, in period, given names usually didn't really have meanings. Those kind of baby book name meanings tend to be post-period inventions. But even if they did, you can't translate them. Because,
nobody's going to call me Sweet Song, and it's obvious that that's actually what the name means.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So you cannot use that in under the Lingua Anglica. It's there for descriptive, it's there for occupationals, and it's there for place names, but not the meaning of the place name, just the standard modern version of the place name. All right, borrowed names. Borrowed names is an interesting one. It says we can borrow name phrases from secular literature, from the Bible, from other religious literature, and from names of saints. And a lot of people say, well, a name is in the Bible, it must be registrable. Everybody uses biblical names. And that's actually not true. Some cultures used them, some didn't. Depending on where and when you were, you used biblical names or not, and you may use some biblical name, but not others. So here's the thing about borrowed names. First of all, they must be linguistically appropriate. The Arthurian legends were known in Italy, and Lancelot was known as Lancelotto. So if you're registering an Italian name and you want to borrow that from the secular literature of Arthurian legend, you have to use Lancelotto, not Lancelot. So you got to stay within the right language. But second, and most important, you have to fit within a pattern of borrowing names. So there has to be evidence of borrowing given names. Also, there has to be evidence that that culture borrowed names in that particular way. And what the rules say that borrowing given names does not support borrowing by names. Borrowing names of major characters doesn't support names of minor characters. And borrowing from one type of literature doesn't support borrowing from another type. We just had a recent discussion about Hebrew names, and someone said, well, the Jews used biblical names all the time. Well, that's not actually true. In many places and period, they used certain biblical names, but not in others. In other places, they used lots of different ones. So you have to show it's a pretty narrow pattern. Just because you were using major characters doesn't mean it's every minor character in the Bible is fair game in that culture. Some are. If you look at late period England, especially among the Puritans and other Protestants, they did use every obscure biblical name under the sun. But that's there and then, not universal. Okay, other sources of name phrases. We have what's called the legal name allowance. And what it says is that you can take an element from the submitter's legal name and use it. You have to provide proof of the name, which could be a photocopy of a driver's license, or it could be, several heralds can look at it and attest that, yep, we saw the driver's license, things like that. There has to be proof of the name. You have to use the exact same form and spelling as in the legal name. You're not allowed to even correct grammar. So, for example, if your client's name is in the real world, his real last name is Smith, he can use it under the legal name allowance to register Smith, but not the Smith, because that's not what it says. So a given name has to be used as a given name, a surname has to be used as a surname. Middle names are a little complicated because they vary. Most modern middle names are given names, so they can be used as given names. A few modern middle names are really derived from by names, in which case we treat them as by names. Madison, for example. If you have someone whose middle name is Madison, that really came from the last name Madison, so we're going to treat that as a by name. It has to meet all the other rules, and it can't be obtrusively modern. So if Moon Unit Zappa comes to us wanting to register his name, we're not going to register Moon Unit even though it's his legal name.
Moon Unit's a girl.
I'm sorry, you're right. What's the other name? Dweezil.
Dweezil.
Dweezil. Probably out as well. Okay, so other sources of name phrases. We have what's called a branch name allowance, which basically means you can say of whatever SCA branch name you have as a by name. So I'm here in Ustgard, you can say of Ustgard. You have to use the exact spelling, grammar, and language as in the registered SCA branch name. So for example, here in the East Kingdom, we can register somebody is of the East. You cannot register it von Osten, which is German for of the East, because that's not the registered name of the kingdom. And by the way, this is not registered limited by kingdom. If somebody from Ethelmark wants to register himself as of the East, the College of Arms is not going to stop him. We don't check citizenship papers. But it has to be in exactly the same form, and you must use the word of as the preposition. For example, we have a group up in French Canada called Fontaine d'un Sable. It would have to be registered as of Fontaine d'un Sable. Not, even though grammatically the French would make much more sense as de Fontaine d'un Sable, you cannot do that under the branch name allowance. Now, if the submitter can document that name, then he can just document it as a normal locative. But if he or she is using the branch name allowance, you've got to do it this way. And an important note, households are not branches. So you cannot use a household name under the branch name allowance. So you can't be of the Great Dark Horde unless you can document Great Dark Horde, which is going to be tough. We also have something called the grandfather clause, which basically says name phrases previously registered to an individual may be registered again, even if they're not currently registered. Basically, once you've registered something, not only is it yours forever, you can use parts of it as well. You cannot evade new problems that the name creates, only existing ones. So, for example, if the name was grammatically correct in the old version, you can grandfather it, but is no longer allowed. Let me start again. Let's say you have a name in, I don't know, French, which is documentable only post-1600. But it's correctly formed, and it was allowed to be registered because back in 1973, we didn't know that it was a post-period name. And now you want to use it again. Well, we'll let you use it, even though it's technically post-period. But you can't break grammar. You know, it was grammatically correct before, it's got to stay grammatically correct. It can also be used by a close legal relative. You need either proof or attestation of the relationship. Usually the proof takes the form of a note saying, you know, yes, this really is my son, daughter, spouse, whatever. So, where do we find attested name phrases? One of the best places is articles. heraldry.sc.org and the Academy of St. Gabriel's has hundreds of articles and names. Pretty much anything in those from those sources is good for documentation. It's free, it's online, it's the easiest thing in the world to do. We also have books. We have lots of books. I have a big consulting library. Some other heralds have big consulting libraries. The problem with books is A, there's a lot of them, B, they take up space, C, they're expensive, and D, many of them are out of print, thus making them even more expensive. So what's a good book? Well, first of all, many books are known, and we use them, and you can kind of find out if they're good. But if you have a book that's not known, the two big things we're looking for is, first off, that the forms of the names are dated. You know, something like a name book that says this is an old Irish name is useless to us because we don't know what old Irish name means. Does it mean medieval? Does it mean 18th century? Does it mean early 20th century? The book has to give us dates of when those names were used. And second, it has to not normalize or modernize names. A lot of books, again, especially baby name books and stuff, even if they did good research, they turned the names into their modern spelling. Well, we're not interested in their modern spelling. We're interested in their medieval spelling. So those are two of the things we look for in books. Period documents are always good. If you find something in a period document, that's pretty much as good as it gets. And there's a system called Family Search, used to be called IGI, which is an excellent source for late period names, although it takes a little bit of doing to use it correctly. There's actually a new article on heraldry.sc.org on how to use Family Search. So, now we've got our name phrases. How do we put them together? What's the construction? This is covered in PN2. So first off, all registrable personal names must contain a given name and at least one by name. This bothers a lot of people because a lot of period people have single given names. A lot of people were just John or just Bob, and there wasn't anything else. The problem with that is once somebody registers John, we're now out of Johns. So we don't allow it. You have to have a by name. Every now and then you'll get someone who says, no, I absolutely do not want the by name. It's inappropriate for my persona. It's inappropriate for my time and place. Okay, well, we can't register John. But if you're, John from the East, register John of the East, and then just have all your friends call you John. That's usually the easiest way to fix them. Each name phrase must be grammatically correct for its position in the name. A given name is a given name, a by name is a by name. You don't get to swap places unless the language you're using specifically allows it. In late period English, surnames were turned into given names and vice versa. So you can do it there, but not in early period English. So as an example, the Gaelic given name Fershar, again I'm mangling Gaelic because I'm terrible at Gaelic, if you want to turn it into a patronym, it becomes Mac Ferchar as a masculine or Mick Ferchar as a feminine, because you have to add those articles, those prepositions, and then you also have to lenite the feminine version because Gaelic is even. Well-known fact.
Hey now.
All right. So how do we put them together? First thing we do is we have culturally uniform names. So this is a name which matches a pattern of the grammar of names for a single time and place. It's 14th century English. It doesn't really have to be that narrow as 14th century. But, so if you're dealing with a culturally uniform name, then the next place you go to is Appendix A of SINA. And Appendix A is the single greatest thing in SINA because it basically tells you exactly how to construct 90% of the names you will ever encounter. And it'll give you the patterns. In order for it to be considered a culturally uniform name, all the name phrases have to be from the same time and place. So let's take a look at Appendix A. This happens to be the French section. So we have in the middle row there, I don't know if you can read it, it's kind of small on the screen, but this tells us exactly how to put together a French name. Can you have double given names in French? Yes, you can have them in late period. Can you use locatives? Yes, you can use a phrase, you can use unmarked locative, or you can use in-sign names. How about a patronymic? Yeah, they used marked, but unmarked were more common. Any other relationships? Widow was used. Descriptive occupational ones. Yes, you can use descriptive occupational, and it tells you which articles to use. Can you use dictus names? Yes, and it tells you how do you do that. Can you have double by names? You can, but the second by name is generally a locative. Double surnames are rare. And then the most useful column is the one labeled order, because that tells you exactly how to put something together. So the patterns are a given name and a by name, a given name plus a by name plus a locative, a given name plus a by name plus a dictus by name. So let's say you want to register a name and you have someone wanting to register Francois LeTaylor. Is that okay? Yeah, that's a given name plus a by name. Matches the pattern. Assuming the name elements are attested, the name phrases. How about Francois LeTaylor de Paris? Does that match one of our patterns? It does. Yeah. It's given name plus a by name plus a locative. How about Francois LeTaylor the Red? No, because we don't have it. Well, first of all, you can't. Lingua Anglica, remember? As long as French had the red in French, that's okay.
Oh, see, I thought you had to translate the whole thing.
No, you can't translate the whole thing. You're not allowed to translate Francois at all.
It still sounds really...
It does, I agree. But let's say we said the red in French, but I don't know what it is because I don't speak French. So let's focus on the order issue here. Can you have that? Francois, the Taylor, the red.
No.
That doesn't match any of our orders, so that's no good. Now, this is not every pattern in the world. If you really want to register something that doesn't match that pattern, you've got to document it. If you can document 3 examples of another pattern, you can use that pattern. But any pattern that's in Appendix A is good. And what Appendix A is basically just all the most common patterns that we were able to, that the people who were putting it together were able to get at the time. Now, some languages, the naming patterns are so complicated that they just couldn't fit into the table. Mongolian, for example, just says, see such and such article for an explanation, which has, pages of explaining how to put together a Mongolian name. Other names we just don't know enough about to have documented patterns. And if you look there, it says Frankish, which is an early French name, and it says all patterns in Frankish must be documented. because we just don't have enough information on Frankish to do it for you. So, if you really want to register a Frankish name, that's fine, but it's going to require a good bit of research. Now, if all the name phrases, culturally mixed names. What if you have names that are not all in the same group? We have two situations. If all the name phrases are from the same regional naming group, and Appendix C defines regional naming groups, they must be dated within 500 years of one another. If the name phrases are from two regional groups, then they have to be within 300 years of each other. And let's take a look at Appendix C, because if Appendix A is the best part in SINA, Appendix C is very much the second best part of SINA. This tells you what languages you're allowed to mix. So we have French, and French says after 1100, it's French, Occitan, and Gascon are part of the French naming group. So if all of your name elements are from within French or Occitan or Gascon, you can do it within 500 years. But you can also combine it with Dutch, with English Welsh, with German, with Italian, with Iberian languages. But those are the other naming groups. But in that case, you're limited to 300 years. And if you're before 1100, you can also throw in Scandinavian because, those Vikings just got everywhere and mixed with everybody. And then it goes to the next group, Gaelic. You can mix Middle Irish Gaelic, Early Modern Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, Manx Gaelic, Old Irish Gaelic, Pictish, etc. within 500 years of each other. But if you're mixing it with English Welsh, then you have the 300-year requirement. So if your by name is documented from 900 and your given name is documented from 1512, that's not going to work. You need to find closer ones. All right. For non-appendix, if you have a combination that's not in Appendix C, then you have to document it. You have to document that the elements were used together in personal names of real people, and that they combine naming pools. So what is and you have the same 300 years requirement. So what does that mean? Appendix C does not list Russian and Scandinavian as compatible. This literally came up, and someone said, well, but Russia and Scandinavia had lots of contexts. In fact, the word Russia, Rus, is a Norse word. And they mix names all together. And the response is fine. Show us 3 period examples of people whose given names were Russian and by names were Scandinavian, or vice versa, to show us that the names really were mixed. And we will allow it. And in fact, because we had somebody who was really good on Scandinavian stuff, came up with about 150 examples, and Pelican said, yep, that's more than enough. We're going to add this to Appendix C. Now that's not always possible. We've had people try to combine Chinese and Korean names, and they just couldn't find enough evidence. Doesn't mean it wasn't done. There's just very little on period Korean stuff available, especially in English. So if you want to go beyond Appendix C, you need 3 examples. Now, if a name phrase is documented under the legal name allowance, the branch name allowance, or the grandfather clause, it's treated as neutral in language and time. So, if you're of the East or of Ethelmark, you can combine absolutely anything you want with that. It's considered neutral. Same thing with the legal name, same thing with the grandfather clause, which is a bit weird. Note that lingua anglica is not on this list, because lingua anglica is not neutral. It has to be a translation of something else, which is not neutral. However, you can only combine it with a name phrase from a single regional naming group. So, for example, if my legal first name is Julian, I can combine that with Smith, which is an attested English name, to make Julian Smith. However, I cannot make myself Julian Smith de Paris, because that would be legal name plus an English name, Smith, plus de Paris, a French name. Now, if I can document Julian as a English name or as a French name, then I can combine those two. But off the legal name allowance, I'm only allowed 1 regional naming group. may not be combined with name phrases from 2 or more regional groups. And I didn't say it before, you're always limited to 2 regional groups. You can't have 3. So, if we go back to Appendix C here and says, well, French can be combined with Dutch and with German. You can't have a name that's French and Dutch and German. It's any 2 is the limit. Okay. Some names are not in Latin scripts, and we register only names in Latin scripts for a couple of reasons. First off, most of us only have keyboards that do Latin. Second of all our software really only supports Latin with a few special characters. So we have to convert things to Latin.
And I don't want to have to try to file non-Latin characters.
Exactly. So languages like Russian, Japanese, Arabic, Norse runes, etc. have to be transliterated into Latin characters. Now the rule is you have to use any standard transliteration system. And Appendix D of CINA lists a bunch, but you're not limited to those. You just have to be consistent. You have to use the same system for all the name elements. So for example, in Arabic, the name Amina al-Hamadaniya can be transliterated one of 2 ways. You can either have the trailing A's or the trailing AH's. And either one is okay, because either one is consistent. But you can't have an AH in Amina and a no H in the Hamadaniya, because those are 2 different, whatever the Arabic character is, some transliteration systems turn it into an A and some turn it into an AH. And you have to use the same one for all elements. Similarly, if you have all those funny characters and accents and what's not, then it's all or none. You have the name Thomas More in Gaelic. You can have it with accents, you can have it without accents, but you can't have just one accent, accents in some parts of the name and accents and no accents in the other. Same thing with the Norse characters like Thorn and Eth and all the other funny characters that we do allow. All right, obtrusive modernity. We do not allow names that are obtrusively modern. And now, you can have joke names, because people had joke names. So we've previously registered names like Drew Steele, Moldy Cheddar, and Hilarious Drunk was just registered on the most current LOA. The standard is you can't register names that yank the reader out of a medieval mindset and into a modern or fantasy mindset. So names that have been banned in the past are Porsche Audi, Artemisian Tank Corps, and I still want to know how in the world they documented that one, and Geeky Herald. Because those 3, while they're documentable, they were able to document Porsche and Audi as period names, that just, as the line says, yanks the reader out of medieval mindset. Speed Bump was another one that they wouldn't allow. So you can absolutely have joke names, just not, obtrusively modern ones. All right, so names must also be free of conflict, presumption, and offense. Conflict says we can't have names that are too close to another SCA name, and you can get a letter of permission to conflict to resolve it. We're not going to cover conflict in this class. That's scheduled for names 103. Presumption says you cannot use names that are too close to an important non-SCA person or which claim special powers or position. And offense prohibits names that are offensive to the populace or general public. The important thing about these rules is that these are modern SCA rules requirements. Everything we saw before were construction rules. And with construction rules, the answer to just about any rule is, but I have evidence that it was done this way in period. If you have documentation for something, documentation trumps any of those rules. However, documentation has nothing to do with these 3. Conflict, presumption, and offense cannot be avoided by saying, but this is period, because these are really modern rules in our system. So let's look at presumption. Presumption is the impermissible claim to rank, power, identity, or relationship with a non-SCA person. So first off, a letter of permission to conflict cannot solve a presumption. So if you want to register, my SCA name is Yehuda ben Moshe, and you want to register something very close to it and it's a conflict, you can ask me for a letter saying that it's okay to do so. if you try to register the name Harry Potter, which is a perfectly period medieval English name, you cannot register Harry Potter. Even if you go to J.K. Rowling and get a letter from her saying it's okay, we're still not going to register it. Because this is a presumption issue, not a conflict issue. And you cannot get permission to presume. And there's lots of different types of presumption. We're going to hit most of them in here. So, first is a claim to rank. You cannot use an element that appears to be a title. And here's what we mean. If you have an attested by name that is identical to an SCA title, you cannot use it unless you're entitled to the title. So, for example, we have evidence of knight and chevalier as period name in English and in French. But only someone who's been knighted in the SCA is allowed to use those name elements. So even though, you know, John Knight is a perfectly registrable name, you cannot register John Knight unless you have been knighted. However, it's only those exact forms. So in Italian, Viscount, which is a protected title, is Visconte, with an E at the end. However, there's also the Italian by name Visconti with an I at the end. And it clearly derives from the same root, but it doesn't carry the same meaning. So that version of the name is permitted. It has to be the exact. It's only restricted if it's the exact title used in the SCA or one of the standard translations of those titles. We also have by names that are identical to a non-SCA title are not considered presumptions. So, for example, Pope is a surname used by normal people, and therefore can be registered. You know, if you register John Pope, we're not going to say, "Wait a minute, you're claiming to be the Pope." No, it's just a name. So we protect SCA titles more than we protect non-SCA titles. If you have attested given names that are identical to titles, you can use them as long as it's obviously not a claim to rank. So Regina, which is a period name, also means queen in Latin. You cannot register Regina of England or Regina of Trimaris, because that suggests that you're claiming to be the Queen of England or the Queen of Trimaris. However, if you're registering Regina the Laundress, it's pretty clear you're not claiming to be the Queen of anything much. So that's perfectly fine. If you have an attested by name that incorporates the name of society orders or real world orders, that's not presumption. So you can be Delarose or at Pelican, and those are not presumptuous of the names. And the difference here is that these are not forms of address, right? Knight is a form of address. You can call someone Knight, John, John the Knight. You wouldn't call someone Knight, John the Pelican. Pelican is the name. It's not a title; it's an order name. If you do want to use one of those restricted names of SCA rank, you can only use them if you have a permanent SCA rank. So a court baron may use the name baron as a by name, because a court baron is a baron for life. It's a permanent rank. However, a landed baron, that's not a permanent title. It's a temporary one. Although most of them end up becoming court barons after they step down, until they've got that court barony, they're not allowed to use baron. Which is why no one can use king or princess, because those are always temporary titles. We have something called dynastic names, which are by names that are uniquely used by a single dynasty. You can't do that. And the only one I know offhand is the Hohenstaufen, which was a ruling dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire. No one except members of that dynasty ever used the name Hohenstaufen. So you cannot register the name Hohenstaufen because that's presumptuous as a claim to be one of those Hohenstaufen. On the other hand, names like Tudor, Stuart, and Bourbon were used by lots of people. So that is okay to use because you're not, it doesn't look like a claim to be, one of the ruling Tudors or Stuarts. You can't combine a family name and location of an important noble and the area they rule. So even though Campbell and Argyll are perfectly registrable, you can't be Campbell of Argyll because that's the ruling family. You can't be Tudor of England. You can be Tudor and you can be of England, but you can't be a Tudor of England. That's considered presumption. It implies that you're one of those Tudors. So those are okay by themselves. In a few languages, there's what's called an honorific name, which are name phrases that are only given out as awards by important nobles. I don't know many of these. There's two in Arabic, Salah al-Din and Saif al-Mulk. These were names that were, someone important would have to have given someone the right to use one of those names. So they're almost like titles, but they're not. They're names, so they're a little weird. You can't use one of those because you know. All right, and there's the next thing is you can not make a claim based on a combination of occupational and locative names. So, for example, champion is a documentable given name. You cannot be champion of Eldermere because it implies that you're the champion of Eldermere. Bard is a name, but you cannot be the Bard of Armagh, which was a important position. On the other hand, you can absolutely be Laundress of York because there's presumably more than one Laundress of York, and it's not claiming any particular rank. Claim of powers. Names cannot contain unmistakable claims of superhuman abilities, magical powers, or divine origin. And this was very important in the early days of society when you had lots of, elven sons and dwarven children and whatnot. Note that names that were used by normal people are okay. And one of the examples is with Norse. There are actually lots of Norse people who went by the name of Odinson, son of Odin. Sure sounds like divine origin, but because normal people used it, we will allow you to register Odinson. However, we've never seen anyone use the name Loki in any context in period other than by reference to the god. No one named their kid Loka's son. So you can't be that either, because that's a claim that you're the son of the god. This is presumably because Loki is a pretty negative character, and why would you name yourself after Loki? It would be kind of calling yourself, son of Satan or something like that. Probably done these days, probably would get you killed real quick in period. Important non-SCA people, you cannot make a claim of identity or close relationship with important non-SCA people. This uses the same rules as for conflicts, which we'll cover in a separate class, but this includes both real people and fictional people. And one of the important things is, what's an important non-SCA person? So first of all, if someone's an important person, we protect them in all the forms in which their names were known. So if we're protecting Christopher Columbus, we also protect Cristobal Colon and Christophorus Columbus, because these were all names that he was known by in period. However, we only protect names that someone was known by. So Carlos V of Spain, who was a king, was also the Count of Barcelona. That was one of his titles. But we've never seen him referred to as Carlos of Barcelona. It could have been, but he wasn't. So that's not a name that we protect for Carlos.
Another point I would add to the part about close relationship, even if you actually claim them as your ancestor, if it's an important period person, we aren't going to let you.
So there are two.
That as a name.
Yeah, there are two elements to this. One, you cannot get name. You cannot. Presumption is presumption. You don't get to. There's no way around it. Even if you're. Number two, you are not your persona, and your persona are not you. So even though you, the legal person, may be descended from somebody, your persona is not. And that's why we will not allow you to use your complete legal name as an SA name. There has to be some difference. This is why if you're entitled to bear arms in the real world, we will not let you register those arms, because that's your real world person's arms, not your persona's arms.
We just had a recent one where there was an important chieftain from Ireland, and she claimed that she is actually a descendant and wanted to put that in her name.
Right.
That she was a daughter.
Yeah. And that's fine. She could be, but her persona is not. And that's exactly the point. So what's an important non-SC person? Generally, the rule has been that if someone is not considered important, if they do not have an entry in a standard print encyclopedia. This is not Wikipedia, because Wikipedia, every minor fictional character has an entry. But if you take, if someone still has a print encyclopedia and it's in there, and it's not in there, chances are that person is not important enough to protect. We usually will protect sovereign rulers of significant states. These are, modern countries, or countries that medieval countries that became parts of important parts of the modern countries. We will not protect minor city-states. We're not going to protect every Italian and German city-state in period because there was infinite quantities of them. But we'll protect major areas like Burgundy or England or such. And one of the standards is individuals whose names are recognized by a significant number of people in the SCA. This came up recently with a reference to Anne McCaffrey's Pern books. Someone registered a name that was very, very indicative of that, and the question was, well, is that an important? Are those books important? And 20 or 30 years ago, probably 99% of the population of the SCA would have read those books. Today, they have waned in popularity, but they're still very well known, and so that was ruled as being important enough to protect. Whether somebody is important or not is always a call made by Pelican. Kingdom heralds don't make that call. Submitting heralds don't make that call, unless you have evidence. If you have a client who says, "Well, I want to submit this. I don't think that person's important enough to protect," unless you can find precedent that that person's already been ruled important enough to protect, let your client know about the problem and then send it out, because only Pelican can make the decision about who is and who is not important. Fictional characters are considered important non-SCA people if a significant number of people in the SCA would recognize the name, and if the use of the name would be considered a reference to that character. So I mentioned Harry Potter as an example. We also have something called a combination presumption, where you have a combination of a name and device, may be presumptuous even if the name and the device by themselves are not. So you can register York, you can register Lancaster, but if you have York and put a white rose on your device, or Lancaster and a red rose on your device, that's too close a claim to be one of those members of those important houses. All right, offense. A name is not registerable if a large segment of the populace of the SCA or of the general public would consider it offensive. Again, this is a modern standard. Just because it was used in period doesn't mean it's not offensive.
Heck, there are people who name their children offensive things now.
Yeah, well, that's fine. they can't register that either. This is a standard based on modern perception, and it's not dependent on clarity. If you have something offensive in a foreign language, it's still offensive even if most English speakers wouldn't understand it. So what's offensive? Vulgar names. This includes names which contain pornographic or scatological items. Names which refer in explicit ways to genitalia will not be registered, though references to other body parts are permitted. There's lots of Norse names that have very graphic references to genitalia. They're period, they're not registered. Euphemisms are fine. I mean, that's what a euphemism is, right? It's a way to say something offensive without being offensive, so it's permitted. Names that appear vulgar to the modern English listener will not be allowed, even if they're not vulgar in the original language. This is a little bit of a Anglo-centric aspect of the SCA, but there it is. You can't have offensive religious terminology, which would be names which include religious terms that are offensive if they mock the beliefs of others, that are overly religious or contain incongruous combinations. For example, Muhammad the Pope would probably piss off just about everybody. Mary the Harlot of Babylon would probably also offend an awful lot of people. You cannot register names like that. Derogatory stereotypes, names which are ethnic, racial, or sexual. That's a typo there, obviously. Sexuality-based slurs will not be registered. Offensive political terminology is not allowed. Names which include terms associated with social or political movements or ideas that are offensive. There's a period German by name Judenfiend, which means enemy of the Jews. We're not going to register that. And then you have to look at names as a whole, not just individual elements. So, for example, names that mock a public person or a member of the society by adding the element like idiot are not permitted. But the reference has to be pretty unmistakable. Note that the rule actually says or another member of the society, so it's perfectly okay to call yourself an idiot. You just can't take, someone else's name and stick something like idiot on the end. So that's about that. That's the rules for constructing a registrable name. I'm going to leave you with the same final thoughts I always do, and that's to not confuse registrable and authentic. Submission has to be registrable. It doesn't have to be authentic. We encourage people to make authentic names and devices. We should encourage people to be authentic, but we can't and shouldn't force them. If a client has something they really want to register, but it's not very authentic, you should still process it. That's the proper way to do it. This is a customer service job. It's our job to help our clients, even though it's not really a job and we don't get paid for it. We're here to help registration happen, not prevent it from happening. The College of Heralds has a reputation as a bunch of people that always say no. We really are trying to fight that reputation. So try to be helpful. Try to help clients create registrable submissions they like. When you're commenting, look for reasons to allow registration, not just prohibit it. This is, in reality, you do both. But it's an issue of if you're commenting on something, you say, well, this is in conflict with such and such. That's good. That's useful. What's even more useful is something like, well, this is in conflict, but if you make this minor change, it clears the conflict. And then there's no other conflict. So we want to try to be helpful. We want to try to encourage, get things registered. We want to be helpful, not obstructions. So, once again, I'm Elmet Herald. You can reach me at either of those emails, and this handout will be posted on yehudaherald.com/EKHU, East Kingdom Herald University. That's the only URL you need to write down, because that will take you to this handout where you can get all the other links and all the other classes that are offered. Questions? Answers?
No, I think I followed.
Okay, that's good. If there are no other questions, I'm going to terminate the broadcast and say good night.